The dress was the wrong size. Nora had known it since the morning fitting, when the zipper caught halfway up her back, and the seamstress exchanged a look with the maid of honor that Nora wasn't supposed to see. She'd smiled anyway. She was good at that, smiling through things that didn't fit. She was still smiling when she found Ethan in the coat room off the hotel ballroom, 40 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, his hands on someone else's waist. Not a stranger's waist. Darcy's. Her cousin Darcy, who had flown in from Phoenix specifically for this wedding, who had hugged Nora at the airport and said, "You deserve this, you really do," and then looked Nora dead in the eye and meant something else entirely. Nora didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the doorway with her bouquet of white peonies, going limp in her hands, and she did the math. 4 years. 17 months of long distance while Ethan finished his MBA. The apartment deposit she'd paid alone because he was between accounts. The credit card debt she'd taken on for this reception because his family had promised to wire the money by Thursday. And Thursday came and went and she'd stopped asking. She did the math and the numbers didn't lie. They never did. She closed the coat room door quietly, which was the part that surprised her most later. Not the screaming she didn't do, the quiet. She just closed the door, walked back down the hallway past the florist arranging centerpieces, past the hotel staffer with the earpiece, past her mother who called her name once, and she kept walking until she was outside on the loading dock behind the kitchen, still in her dress, bouquet in hand, heels on a rubber mat that smelled like grease and cigarettes. She sat down on a plastic crate and looked at her shoes. $300 consignment. Still the most expensive shoes she'd ever owned. She was trying to work out the logistics, the deposits that wouldn't be returned, the guests already seated inside, the fact that her phone was in her clutch, and her clutch was at the bridal table, and she had no car and $46 in her checking account until Friday. When the door behind her opened, she didn't turn around. She assumed it was her mother, or possibly the wedding coordinator, a woman named Sheila who had the serene, slightly dead-eyed energy of someone who had seen every possible disaster and charged accordingly. "You're going to ruin those shoes." The voice was low, not unkind, more like a man who had noticed something factual and chose to mention it. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in a dark suit. Not the kind of dark suit that men wore to weddings, but the kind of dark suit that meant the man wearing it had never once questioned whether he was dressed appropriately for a situation, because situations adjusted for him. He was older than her by a decade at least, maybe more. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a scar along his jaw that hadn't come from anything clean. His hands were in his pockets and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual, because Nora could read most people. It was a skill she'd developed early. When you grew up with nothing, you learned to read the room before the room read you. "They're already ruined," she said. "The heel's been clicking since the church. I think I cracked it on the stairs." He glanced down at her shoes, then back up. "You're the bride." "I was." A pause. Was past tense seemed appropriate. He stepped outside, letting the door fall shut behind him. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, which she appreciated. She was not in the mood to be approached. "The groom," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "In the coat room. With my cousin." She looked back at her shoes. So. She finally looked up at him, properly. "Who are you?" "I'm supposed to be at a meeting that got moved to this hotel." He said it like it explained something. "I was in the wrong corridor. Lucky you. I've had worse detours." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that surprised her. She hadn't expected to laugh today. She hadn't expected a lot of things today. "I need to figure out how to get back inside without walking through the ballroom," she said. "My phone is at the bridal table, and my shoes are broken, and I have guests who flew in from 3 different states who don't know yet that the groom is currently." She stopped. "Anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you do?" She blinked. "What?" "For work." It was such an odd question for the moment that she answered it honestly. "Accounts receivable. For a logistics company downtown, I track down money people owe." She paused. "Or I did until last month when they restructured and my position was." She stopped again. It's been a complicated season. He nodded slowly, like she'd said something that meant more than she intended. You're good with numbers, he said. It wasn't a question either. It's the only thing I've ever been good at. She stood up from the plastic crate, wincing when the broken heel shifted. I should go back in, or I should leave. I haven't decided. I need someone who's good with numbers. She stared at him. I'm sorry. Specifically, someone who can read a ledger and tell me where the discrepancies are. I have a situation. He reached into his jacket pocket, and plain white, and held it out. Not today. Obviously. She took the card. His name was on it. One name, just the surname. Crow. A phone number. Nothing else. You're offering me a job, she said. On the loading dock behind a hotel kitchen. While I'm still in my wedding dress, I'm offering you a conversations. His voice was even. What you do with it is your decision. She looked at the card for a long moment. The card stock was heavy, the kind of heavy that cost money. The kind of heavy that said, I don't cut corners on things that represent me. I don't know anything about you, she said. You know I didn't walk past when you were sitting on a crate by yourself behind a hotel. That was true. That was, in fact, a data point. She put the card in her bouquet, tucking it between two peonies because she had nowhere else to put it. I need to go handle this, I know. This conversation didn't happen. Which conversation? She almost smiled. Exactly. She went back inside. She walked through the kitchen, past the sous chef, who pretended not to notice her, past a rack of cooling dinner rolls that smelled like the only good thing she'd experienced all day. She retrieved her phone from the bridal table while the string quartet was playing something Ethan had chosen, something she'd never liked, and she texted her mother 3 words, "Don't seat anyone." And then she went and found the wedding coordinator Sheila and said, in a very calm voice, "We have a situation." What happened next took 40 minutes and involved a lot of crying that wasn't hers. Her mother cried. Sheila cried, which was unprofessional but understandable. "Darcy," when Nora found her, said Nora, "I can explain," in the tone of someone who knew they could not explain. And Ethan said, "Baby, just let me talk to you," in the tone of someone who had never once in 4 years actually listened to her talk. Nora said nothing to either of them. She organized the refunds where refunds were possible. She made 3 phone calls. She arranged for the out-of-town guests to have their hotel rooms comped through the following morning, which took some negotiating with the front desk manager and cost her a dignity she found she could afford to spend. She called her landlord and confirmed her apartment was still hers. She'd never moved out, technically, because Ethan's place was never actually available when it was supposed to be, and she'd stopped asking about that too. She did all of it in the dress, because she had nothing else to wear, and the dress was already ruined. By 7 o'clock she was back in her apartment, sitting at her kitchen table, still in the dress, a glass of water in front of her because she'd forgotten to eat, and alcohol on an empty stomach seemed like a decision she'd already made enough of. The business card was on the table. She'd taken it out of the bouquet somewhere between the hotel lobby and the parking garage. Crow. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the $46 in her checking account. She thought about the 3 months of rent she'd covered alone while Ethan was between accounts. She thought about the accounts receivable position, which had paid $41,000 a year, which had felt like enough until it wasn't, and now was gone. She thought about the way he'd said, "You're good with numbers," not like a compliment, but like a conclusion he'd already reached before he said it out loud. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again, dialed the number on the card, and waited. He answered on the second ring, no greeting. Just Quinn. She'd never told him her last name. "You already know who I am," she said. "I had time while you were handling your situation. That's," she paused, "that should probably alarm me more than it does." "Probably," he agreed. "What kind of work are we talking about?" A brief silence, not hesitation. More like a man deciding how much of a doorway to open at once, the kind that doesn't get discussed on the phone. "There's a restaurant on Mercer Street. Albans. Tomorrow noon. I have nothing else on my calendar," she said, which was darkly funny, and also true. "I know." She looked at the business card. "Miss Crow, Yes, if this turns out to be something I can't live with, I will find a way to make that your problem. Another silence. Then, very quietly, something that might have been the beginning of a sound she'd later classify as almost a laugh. I'd expect nothing less. He hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in her ruined dress, and for the first time all day, the numbers in her head went quiet. Albans was the kind of restaurant where the menu didn't have prices, which meant the prices were the kind that would have made Nora's mother grip the table edge. She'd looked it up the night before, old habit, knowing the terrain, and had dressed accordingly, or as accordingly as she could manage from a closet that ran toward practical. She arrived 5 minutes early, because she always arrived 5 minutes early. It was the only way to be sure you saw who was already in the room. He was already in the room. He was at a corner table with a sight line to both the door and the kitchen, which told her something. He stood when she approached, which told her something else. Not chivalry, exactly, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who catalogued things. There were 2 other men at nearby tables who were not eating. They were watching the room. She noted this and sat down. "You look better," he said. "Lower bar than yesterday." "Lower bar," he agreed. The waiter came. Crow ordered without looking at the menu. Nora ordered the second cheapest thing she could identify from the description, which was still $32, which she silently filed as research expense, non-reimbursable. "Tell me about the discrepancies," she said when the waiter left. He looked at her for a moment. Most men, she'd found, were either unsettled by directness, or they were the kind who'd been surrounded by people too afraid to be direct, and those men were a different kind of tired. She was trying to work out which kind he was. "I have a business," he said. "Several, technically. The surface ones are legitimate. The others," a pause, "have what you might call informal accounting. Informal, numbers that are supposed to match don't. Money that should be in one place shows up somewhere else, or doesn't show up at all. I've had 3 people look at the books in the last year. 2 told me everything was fine." He stopped. "And the third isn't available anymore." She absorbed that. Available as in he found a different line of work, quickly. His voice was flat. "I'm not in the business of hurting accountants, Miss Quinn. I'm in the business of knowing what I actually have, so I can make decisions based on what's real. And someone in your organization doesn't want you to know." "That's the hypothesis." She looked at him. The scar along his jaw in natural light was more pronounced than it had been on the loading dock. There was another one along his left hand, faint and silver, the kind that comes from something that happened a long time ago. "Why me?" she said. "You closed a coat-room door quietly when most people would have made a scene. You organized refunds in a wedding dress instead of falling apart. You called a number on a card that a stranger gave you on a loading dock, and the first thing you said was what kind of work." He folded his hands on the table. "You're not sentimental about situations you can't control. You deal with what's real. Those could also describe a person with no good options." "Yes," he said. "Those too." She appreciated that he didn't lie about it. "What are you offering?" she said. "Monthly retainer, 3 months to start, renewable. Access to the relevant accounts, the relevant people, and whatever you need to do the work. You report directly to me. Nobody else." He named a number. Nora kept her face very still, which was a skill she'd also developed early. The number was more than she'd made in the last 2 years combined. "And if I find what you're looking for," she said, "then I have what I need, and if what I find makes things complicated for you, then I deal with it, and if what I find makes things complicated for me." His eyes were steady on hers. "Grey," she noted, "the color of overcast sky over water. That won't happen." "You can't promise that." "No," he said. "I can tell you that it hasn't happened to anyone I've made that statement to. You can weight that however you like." She thought about this. She thought about $46 and 3 months of back Ethan, and the accounts receivable job that was gone, and the dress currently hanging on the back of her closet door, because she couldn't decide if she was going to return it, or burn it, or just leave it there forever, as a monument to the worst Thursday of her recent life. She thought about the way he'd said "you're good with numbers," like it was settled. like it had been settled before she'd said a word. "I need 2 days to look into you," she said. Something shifted in his face, microscopically. 2 days. If I'm going to work for someone, I need to know what I'm working for, or at least what I can find out. She met his eyes. "I won't go looking where you've told me not to look. I understand there are limits. I just need to know you're real. I'm real. The verifiable kind of real." This time the sound happened. Brief, almost involuntary. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. 2 days, he said. She spent those 2 days doing what she was good at. Public records, corporate filings, news archives. His name appeared in contexts that confirmed the shape of things. Business dealings that pointed in directions she'd need to not look too closely at. A lawsuit from 9 years ago that was settled with terms undisclosed. A construction company in a city she'd never visited that held a contract with the city government, which meant he had people who could make that kind of thing happen. He was real. He was the specific kind of real that meant power, and power meant someone somewhere was always trying to take something from him, and that was why the numbers didn't match. She called him at the end of the second day. "I'll do it," she said. "What changed your mind?" "Nothing changed. I didn't have doubts." She paused. "I just needed to make sure I knew what I was walking into. And now you do. I know the outline." She looked at the notes she'd made, organized in a way that would mean nothing to anyone else. "I still don't know you." "No," he said, "you don't." She started the following Monday. There was an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown that turned out to belong to one of his surface businesses, a property management company with a name she'd never heard. The office had a locked file room, a computer already logged in, and a stack of ledgers that made her stomach do something complicated when she opened the first one. It was the ledgers that told her how bad it was. The skimming was careful, patient, the kind of skimming that takes years to learn, where the numbers don't disappear all at once but drift, a little at a time, adjusted in columns that most people don't read carefully. Someone had moved money through 17 different accounts and reconciled it against expense reports that, if you looked at them in isolation, were perfectly believable. But Nora didn't look at things in isolation. She looked at patterns, and patterns lied only when you let them. She worked for 3 weeks without telling him what she'd found. She needed to be sure. She needed the full picture, not the hypothesis, because if she was wrong about any piece of it, she would be telling the most dangerous man she'd ever met that someone in his organization was stealing from him. And she needed to be right. On a Thursday, she noted the irony. She put everything in a folder and walked down the hall to his office. He looked up when she came in. She put the folder on his desk. "It's been going on for at least 4 years, she said. "Possibly longer, but the earlier records are incomplete. 1 person, possibly 2 working in coordination. The amount is significant." She named the number. He didn't move. She'd expected something, anger maybe, or that particular stillness that comes before anger. Instead, he looked at the folder, then back at her, and she couldn't read him, which still happened sometimes, which she was starting to think might always happen. "You're sure," he said. "I'm not in the habit of presenting things I'm not sure of." He opened the folder. He read for a long time. She stood across from him and waited, because she understood that some processes needed to complete before you interrupted them. When he finally looked up, something in his face had changed, in a way that was small and hard to name. Like a door that had been open a crack had either opened a little more or shut a little more, and she couldn't tell which. "How long have you known?" he said. "I confirmed it 6 days ago. I spent the remaining time verifying. You could have told me when you confirmed it." "I could have. I chose to be thorough instead." She paused. "If that's a problem." "It's not a problem." He looked back at the folder. "Sit down, Miss Quinn." She sat. "The person in question," he said, "has been with me for 11 years. She waited. "He has access to information that would be significant if he chose to use it. Which means this is not simply about money." "No," she said. "It rarely is." He looked at her with something she couldn't name. Not gratitude. He didn't seem like a man who produced gratitude easily, but something that acknowledged that she'd given him something real, and he was the kind of man who kept track of that. "I need to think," he said. "I know. I'll need you to." He stopped. Started again. "I'll need to ask you to be careful. For a time. About who knows what you know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm always careful, more careful than usual. Then I'll need to understand what more careful looks like in your specific context." He regarded her for a moment. "I'll have someone walk you through it. I'd prefer you walked me through it." Something moved across his face. She caught it this time, barely. Surprise, maybe. Or something that functioned like it, in a man who'd learned to keep most of what he felt below the surface. "All right," he said. "I'll walk you through it." It was the first thing he'd agreed to that she'd asked for directly. She noted it the way she noted everything. Quietly, filed, waited. The weeks after that were different. Not easier, exactly, but different. She learned the shape of his days. The hours he was in the office, and the hours he wasn't. The way his people moved around him with a careful orbit that told her something about how much he was trusted, and something about how much he was feared, and how those two things existed in him simultaneously without seeming to cancel each other out. She learned that he was meticulous, that he read everything himself and remembered it, that he slept less than was probably healthy and drank coffee that was too strong at hours when coffee shouldn't exist. She learned that he sometimes stood at the window at the end of the day and looked at the city in a way that didn't look like he owned it, but like he'd made a deal with it a long time ago and was still deciding whether it had been worth it. One evening she was still at her desk when he came out of his office and stopped when he saw her. "It's past 8, he said. "I know what time it is." He looked at what she was working on. "That can wait." "It can't actually. I found another thread this afternoon. If I leave it, I'll lose the context." She didn't look up. "I'll be done in 30 minutes. He was quiet. She expected to hear him leave. Instead, she heard him move, and then the chair across from her desk pulled back, and she looked up to find him sitting in it, jacket off, tie loosened, looking like a man who was also not going to leave yet. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know." She went back to the numbers. He sat there, and she didn't know what he was doing. She didn't look up to find out. But after a while, the silence stopped feeling like surveillance and started feeling like something else. Something that didn't have a name in the ledger she kept for things she was willing to acknowledge. When she finished and gathered her papers, she looked up and found him looking at the window, the city beyond it, arranged in its usual geometry of light. "I grew up in a house where the heat got shut off in November," she said, because she wasn't sure why, and she'd learned that the things she said without planning were usually the ones she meant. "We cooked on the same burner we used for heat. I did my homework by that light. The numbers were the only things that stayed consistent. Heat was variable. Food was variable. My mother's moods were variable." She paused. "The numbers stayed the same whether we had money or not. I liked that." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you've been trying to understand what kind of person I am for 6 weeks, and I'm saving you some time." "What kind of person are you?" he said. "The kind who won't steal from you," she said. "The kind who won't lie to you, even when the truth is inconvenient. And the kind who will walk out that door and not look back if I find out that you've lied to me." He held her gaze. "I know." "Do you?" "I've known since the loading dock." She looked at him. "Then why? Because some things you confirm even when you're already sure." His voice was quiet, the same quality it had had on the loading dock, that first day, not unkind. Precise. Like a man who chose every word the way he chose everything else, because he understood that imprecision was expensive. She understood that. She understood it in a way that felt like the first fluent conversation she'd had in a very long time. She picked up her bag. 30%, she said, at the door. He looked at her. "When this is over, when you've dealt with the situation, I want 30% of whatever you recovered." She said it steadily. "Not as a bonus, as a fee. I found it, I documented it, I protected the information. That has a price." He was silent for a long moment. 25, 28. Another silence. Something moved in his face that was unmistakably the same sound she'd heard on the loading dock, finally allowed a little more room. 28, he agreed. She nodded once and left. She was 3 blocks away before she realized her hands had been steady the entire time, and that, too, was a kind of data point. She filed it where she filed the other things she wasn't ready to name yet. Carefully, in order, with a note that said return to this later. She was, after all, good at keeping records, and this one, she was fairly certain, was just getting started.